It would be completely fair to claim that Interplay, primarily during a stretch from 1996 to 2000, were single-handedly responsible for either developing or publishing some of the greatest role-playing games of all time. The first two Fallout games, the first two mainline Baldur's Gate titles and their expansions, along with games like Icewind Dale and Planescape Torment, all had Interplay's fingerprints on them in some way. All of those games earned the lofty reputations they've received, and other titles like Stonekeep and Bard's Tale certainly didn't hurt in establishing Interplay as one of the premier companies in the computer gaming space. So, how was it, after a blistering 4-year stretch, that Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2, a console game that effectively hawked the Baldur's Gate title for nothing more than marketability, which released in 2004, became the company's swan song? Now, I know I had previously said that I wouldn't make a video about Dark Alliance 2, but I went back and watched my episode about the first game fairly recently, and I know it's not fair to judge it so harshly, but I've always kind of considered the Icewind Dale video to be the true start of Musings of an Idiot. I don't think it's a horrible video, and it would probably do one some good to give it a watch before this one, but it's not an entry I'm overly proud of. But considering I espouse the virtues of the second game in that video, petitioning for it to get a port to modern systems, not taking the time to talk about it in some form feels disingenuous. Anyway, back to how this game became the last gasp for a quickly crumbling company. As far as I can tell, after poring over way too many articles, sales figures, and even some legal documents, Interplay, I think, could most succinctly be summed up as a company comprised of superstar developers, a veritable super team, if you will, that had absolutely no idea how to plan or budget what they were doing. The fact that Interplay developed and published phenomenal games is hardly surprising, when you've got names like Brian Fargo, Chris Avallone, Josh Sawyer, Tim Kaine, Rebecca Heineman, and a slew of others, many of whom are still involved in game design today, and for very good reason, working at your company. The fact that you can crank out exceptional, even genre-defying games is far from shocking. Whether at Interplay itself or its main in-house studio of Black Isle, this was pretty much an Avengers-esque lineup of people working together. But for as good as Interplay was at making games, especially those they developed themselves, it's painfully clear that no one had any goddamn idea how to keep the ship afloat so that they could actually continue to do so. For whoever's responsibility it was, a measure of chaos appeared to be a constant at the company. Poor planning seemed to be the standard, not the exception. The workspace at Black Isle was described as chaotic and disorganized, primarily owed to what Avallone referred to as the need to, quote, rely on other companies' tech, notably BioWare's Infinity Engine, which arguably kept the majority of our projects running, since Black Isle couldn't seem to build an engine of its own. But an inability to keep things on the tracks wasn't anything new for Interplay as a whole. Stonekeep, which I swear I will make a video about one day, I promise, was originally slated for a 9-month production cycle and a small budget, if the internet is to be believed. It wound up taking 5 years to complete and over $5 million to produce. The first Fallout started as a one-man project that ballooned to a team of over 30, took 3 years to make, and cost $3 million. Fergus Urquhart, before he became the head of Black Isle, said this of Interplay's production cycles around that time in an interview with PC Games N. The one thing I would say about Interplay in those days, and this isn't trying to pull the veil back or anything like that, there was just shit going on. It was barely controlled chaos. I'm not saying that Brian Fargo didn't have some plan, but there was just stuff. The problem with this type of chaos is that it makes it entirely impossible to adequately plan or control finances. For the most part, you can only reasonably, and certainly responsibly, plan for what you have on hand. So when a game like Stonekeep goes so massively over budget, chances are those additional funds, which you couldn't originally plan for, are coming from places you would rather they didn't. Loans with likely terrible interest rates, especially for as much as Interplay was spending, selling off assets, layoffs, stuff like that. It's bad money, even if it will get you across the finish line in the short term. Mind you, none of the figures attributed to the production of these games themselves account for overhead costs such as necessary office rent and services, or securing things like distribution and advertising. Even if the games make back what was ultimately spent on them, it's just not the same as if they had been properly accounted for to begin with. Take Fallout, for example. The game sold somewhere around 120,000 units in the first year following its release. If we use a $40 price point as our cost figure, which is what Baldur's Gate 2 went for based on revenue and unit numbers for that game, that means Fallout only brought in $4.8 million against its $3 million budget. Doesn't seem too horrible at face value until you factor in all the other costs that I just mentioned. In reality, after a year, Fallout probably didn't do much better than break even, and companies really don't survive on breaking even. Of course, there's some speculation here on my part, but businesses typically go under for pretty tried and true reasons, and Interplay had all the markings of a firm that had no idea how to balance its checkbook. I also have a hard time believing that all of this money was going towards game dev. They were reported as losing over $20 million in the course of a single year at one point. Granted, this was towards the end of the company's life, I get it, and I hate to make such a claim with zero evidence, but I just don't know what they could have been spending that much money on. Either they were bad at managing themselves to an almost comical degree, or someone, or more likely many people, were having fun on the company dollar. I mean, their way of saving money as they continued to fall apart was to just cancel ongoing projects, with people starting to abandon ship the original Baldur's Gate 3, a Stonekeep sequel, Fallout Van Buren, all games that not insignificant amounts of time had been spent working on, were trashed. When your best course of action is to admit that money previously spent, as in the production associated with those cancelled games, is simply burnt, you're in trouble. And this was after they went public in '98 to try and convince shareholders to invest in what was obviously a declining company. Of course, Interplay could only outrun its debts for so long, closing Black Isle entirely at the end of 2003 after a series of layoffs, and reshuffling and effectively fading into nothingness itself a short while later. All of which brings us to this game, the sequel to a spin-off from yesteryear released after the house had already burnt down, being developed by what was left of Black Isle. Because it's only fitting, Dark Alliance 2 had its own problems leading up to its release. For one, Interplay was having trouble holding onto its licenses by this point, on account that they were in and out of bankruptcy court so often you'd think they were in the actual banking business itself. Then, because they didn't have enough issues, they backed out of their agreement with their distributor, Vivendi Games, only to then mend fences like a month later. Again, this was obviously a company with a penchant for planning. Most notably, however, they were being sued by Snowblind Studios, who created the Dark Alliance engine, for using said engine without permission. If that sounds confusing, remember that Interplay only published the first Dark Alliance game. It was developed by Snowblind themselves. Eventually, the two sides came to an agreement that would let Interplay continue to use the engine for what they had already developed, but would effectively bar them from using it in anything else. All of this resulted in the release date for Dark Alliance 2 being pushed to January of 2004, meaning, yes, this game was published after Black Isle had already been canned. Oh my god, we can finally talk about the game. I'm going to leave a lot of the articles and documents where I sourced this information from in the description, both because it's interesting and because there's a lot of things I sort of glossed over, mainly because this video already has enough business talk and legalese for a lifetime. Okay? Dark Alliance 2 is very much in line with the game that preceded it, being a hack-and-slash dungeon crawl that sees the player explore the locales of the Forgotten Realms. Unlike the first game, a fair bit of it actually takes place in the city of Baldur's Gate. There's NPCs to converse with, not to mention different buildings to explore, both of which do wonders to breathe some life into the Sword Coast Premier Burg. Otherwise, however, the gameplay systems are largely identical, making use of a heavily modified version of the 3rd edition rule set and pitting the player against wave after wave of enemies to mow through in search of glory and gold. What I think is most notable about this game, only more so because of the circumstances through which it was developed and why I wanted to see it ported to modern systems, is that it's better than the first in practically every way. Don't get me wrong, it's still the largely one-dimensional button-mashing grindfest that the first game was, but it gives you a heck of a lot more to do in comparison. There's more characters to choose from, with 5, deeper and more involved skill trees, letting each character be built in unique ways depending on player preference, and more weapons to wield with which to strike down enemies with. I mean, you get to fight undead pirates in this game, like, come on! Beyond the general mooks, the boss fights are also much punchier, being far more unique and more challenging overall. That last point is likely due to the fact that, while not outstanding, the story in the second game is far better. By that, I mean it actually makes sense and pretty effectively cashes in on plot points that had been set up in the first game. Not to mention, each character has a unique side quest that grants them some added characterization and an exclusive dungeon to run through. The maps are helped by this as well. The theme of this game is a bit darker overall, and that's played out in areas like Bloodmire Manor, which absolutely scared the life out of me as a child. Or how about the Lich's Castle, wherein Lyran, the Lich in question, starts following you around like Death from Gauntlet, being all unkillable and whatnot. One of my favorite new features is the item crafting. Being able to slot gems and trinkets into weapons to make things like flaming swords and whatever else you can get your hands on from the loot you collect is a lot more fun than being strictly bound by what the shopkeepers sell. You can whip up some pretty yoked armaments once you've got the money and resources, which, of course, only makes tearing through the monster manual present more fulfilling. Nothing like swinging a cudgel of your own creation, am I right or am I right? Increased options and just having more to do in general are pretty constant in the second game. Even if you visit the same places in the long run, you're given choice in terms of what to tackle and when, as well as whether or not you want to partake in new, optional excursions. It also contains a similar amount of polish to the first game. The voice acting, while not as laden with superstars, is still outstanding, and the soundtrack is great, composed by Craig Stewart Garfinkel. The first game's issue was not that it was simplistic in premise, but rather that it was almost identical from start to finish, which meant that it got old quickly, a fact which was exacerbated by the way it seemingly devolved as time went on, with the story and areas themselves becoming less and less important or impressive. The second game, in comparison, adds enough little things in the form of quality of life features and more autonomy that just makes it a more enjoyable experience overall. It does actually force you to pay attention and use your brain at points. Not much, but enough to make sure your cerebral cortex is still functioning. That the gameplay is so similar to the first game, so primitively addicting in the same ways, lends to these improvements having more impact than they typically would. Again, Dark Alliance 2 is not a substantially different game from its predecessor, but it is undoubtedly more interesting and does a much better job of actively and consistently giving the consumer something to play for. It's because of these improvements, along with the way it delivers exactly the type of gameplay you want from a title like this, that I think DA2 stands as one of the best console hack-and-slash games that came out in the early to mid-2000s. Champions of Norath probably has it beat, the formula having become so refined by that point, but not by much. And Norath isn't currently available to be bought on modern systems, so which one are you going to realistically play at this point? However, and this is going to be a really long editor's note, while this game has now made its way to modern systems, if you can, I think you'd be better off emulating it. After starting to gather footage for this episode, I noticed some issues with the re-release. Primarily, it did not run that well, which is just weird. There was a lot of choppiness and frame skipping, and I have no idea why, nor could I try to fix it because it basically doesn't have any graphical settings. I'm using the same setup and really don't remember encountering any of these problems with the first game, but I suppose maybe I just wasn't aware of them? I'm also utterly convinced that they screwed with the saturation and lighting in places. Could be a total conspiracy I've convinced myself of, maybe the re-release looks more like the original Xbox versions did back in the day, but as I'm sure you can clearly tell by this side by side, the re-release and the PS2 original look quite a bit different, and I personally don't think the extra color and saturation helps much, especially in darker areas where it's made that the only thing you can see is your character themselves. Part of the reason why previously these re-releases were cool and even important was because both of these games used to be insanely difficult to emulate properly. And while God gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers, he has since decided that this isn't one we need to fight anymore. I'm not kidding, emulation tech has come far enough along that neither of these games are all that difficult to run at this point. I don't have a spaceship for a PC by any means, and I was still able to slap on just about every upscaling and graphical improvement available while recording, and it ran just fine with no real issues found. Except this one in the forest when I started asserting my dominance. These wolves can't f***ing hope to handle me. If you have the means to do so, I don't see how emulation isn't the best way to play this game. The only comparative downside to it is the pixelated text, which is par for the course for pretty much any emulation, and the slight blurriness that seemingly all 6th generation console emulation seems to suffer from when upscaled. But you can easily rectify the latter by enabling the sharpening features that most any modern GPU is capable of nowadays. It looks better and, more importantly, correct, runs better, and if you've already got it lying around, it won't cost you any extra cash. And guess what? If you don't own the disc, the availability of the re-release has devalued it in some cases, meaning you can probably find it for cheaper than the re-release itself. And it's for all of the above reasons that most of the footage you've seen to this point is from an emulator, because unfortunately, many of the issues that plagued the port of the first Dark Alliance game are still present in the second. It costs what I consider an exorbitant $30, doesn't add anything new, and was plagued with issues on release. It also came with some of its own issues. The inventory screen wasn't scaled for whatever reason, and at least when I played, there was some weird crackling and popping in the audio during some of the cutscenes. The ease of having it work out of the box is appreciated, but it's pretty hard to shake the feeling that these were about as lazy a pair of ports as you'll ever see. Also, to me, the fact that they resurrected the Black Isle brand solely to push these disappointing re-releases is kinda scuzzy. And it's scuzzy because Black Isle had a pedigree, one built through releasing some of the very best that the genre had to offer. Their games were, quite simply, a step above the competition, and that's even reflected in Dark Alliance 2. Despite the walls falling down around them, they managed to make a game that is better than the one that came before it, because that's what Black Isle and Interplay did when all was said and done. Using the Black Isle name for these re-releases honestly feels like a cheap way to garner favor with people like myself, who are so appreciative for what those classic games have given us. Black Isle went dark again shortly after the ports, only making it feel even more like that was exactly the type of goodwill they wanted to prey on. Interplay went under because of its own failings. Dark Alliance 2 probably isn't the game that anyone would choose to go out on, but it's emblematic of what made Interplay and Black Isle great for so many years. It's bigger, better, and more enjoyable than most else on the market. I won't tell you to go buy it, I made that mistake in the first video, and frankly, it probably isn't worth it at full price, but it's a fitting, if not picturesque, ending to one of the greatest companies in RPG history.